This video is now in session, and the Democrats did pretty well in the midterms, considering that many people thought, including us, thought that they were going to lose the House by somewhat comfortable margins for the Republican Party, and that they would also lose the Senate. But there is one exception to this good news, or rather two, for the Democratic Party, that being New York and Florida. So in this video, I'm going to talk about why these two states in particular did pretty well for the Republican parties in comparison to the rest of the United States. So let's get started with Florida, because I think that's a little bit easier to explain. Florida, if you look at the results, Marco Rubio, well, actually, let's start with the governorship because that's what's at the top of the ticket. Ron DeSantis won by 19.4 percentage points. That is unheard of margins in Florida, considering that just a few years ago, just 4 years ago, we thought that this race, or at least this state, was a swing state. Back in 2018, Ron DeSantis only won by a few thousand votes. And now you see here he has won with over 1 million votes. And this has gone down ballot as well. And this is something we'll see later on with New York as well, which is that these governorship elections have really big implications for the rest of the races. Here you see Marco Rubio winning by 18.4 percentage points. If you look at all the House districts, you can see here that for a lot of these more what you think would be safe Democratic seats, turned out to be a little bit more risky. Here, Darren Soto only winning by 8 percentage points in a safe Biden district. What used to be Ted Deutsch's seat was won by the Democrat, but by only 5 percentage points, even though Biden won this district by, I believe, more than 8 points back in the 9 points back in the 2020 election. Here you can see 10 points, not even safe margins. If you look at the Tampa Bay area, 14 points, which actually is pretty close to the partisanship of the district. But yeah, you can see, I mean, mostly in the Miami area, a lot of these Democrats in these like more, I guess, slightly lighter blue districts have not done as well as Biden in the 2020 election. So what explains all of this? It pretty much comes down to what's happened to the Floridian economy these past 2 years. Ever since COVID happened, Florida has been on a rise. And that's because Ron DeSantis opened up Florida much earlier than many other governors. Now, at the time, many people criticized him for being reckless with people's health, as COVID at that time we thought COVID was a pretty dangerous virus, and to some extent it still kind of is. But Ron DeSantis took that risk, and because of that, it paid off. Like, if you look at the economy, a lot of people have moved down to Florida because of the lockdown, the ease of lockdown restrictions, and a lot of businesses have moved down to Florida because it's sunny weather, it's lack of taxes, and then as well as, again, COVID. So ever since like DeSantis started easing COVID restrictions, tourism's gone up in places like Orlando, Tampa, Miami, and then you have business. A lot of financial companies, such as I think Ken Griffith's company, had moved from Chicago, a very Democratic place, to Miami, which is becoming more Republican because of business, because of what he says is business-friendly policies in the state for his company Citadel. And then you also have a huge housing market that's been absolutely booming in the state for the past 2 years, especially in the Sarasota region, in the Orlando region, and to some extent the Miami region, although that place is a little bit more saturated. But all of these factors make for a situation where if you were in Florida in the past 2 years, I mean, you've been living a pretty good life. Even though there's been inflation, and even though there are high gas prices in Florida are lower than than the national average, and you have this like growth in income because of these high scale companies that have been moving in and rejuvenating economy by Americans outside of Florida, bringing money into the state for tourism and housing. So yeah, it's not a surprise to see the incumbents doing well, and the incumbents are generally the Republican Party. But there's also another thing that's happening here. Hispanic outreach is growing with the Republican Party in the state. Initially, this outreach was limited to Venezuelans and Cubans who were easy targets for the Republican Party because many of those immigrants came from those two countries, have been fiscally irresponsible over these past few years. But they have expanded that messaging to the rest of the Hispanic community, and that's generally worked. The message of being fiscally responsible, of being family oriented, those all appeal to both the culture and general thinking of Hispanic immigrants and Caribbean immigrants that have moved to the Miami-Dade region. So that's why you see right now Miami's mayor is a Republican. That's why you see for this kind of district, which Biden lost by, I believe, only 4 percentage points in 2020, how it was won by Carlos Gimenez by, I think that is over like 28 percentage points. So yeah, that's a very big fact. That's a very large margin. This district, which Biden won by, I believe, 4 points, Maria Salazar won this district by 14 points. And that is because of Hispanic outreach. So those are just some of the factors that led to Republicans winning in this state. It's actually a lot more like individually it's a lot more individual than national in terms of the reasons why, but yeah, I mean, you could make the argument that Ron DeSantis hurt himself by getting him into social issues, but to be honest, Floridian voters don't care if the economy is doing pretty well, and the economy was doing super well at that period. So Ron DeSantis won easily, even with the comments that he made, and that only just helps him elevate himself among the conservative party for the 2024 presidential election. Now let's move to New York. New York, this is a little bit more complicated, but it's still very easily explainable, and it has very much to do with just statewide issues, not national issues. Abortion and the economy. I mean, the economy has some importance in New York, but in New York City particularly, but abortion don't really have much of an issue or of an effect here because New York is such a democratic state to begin with. So New York, how I would explain it is you have to look at the governor's races first, and then you have to take those explanations and then bring it down ballot, because a lot of people in New York just vote the same party down ballot. There's not as much split ticket voting as there used to be in the state. So the governor's races, we thought that Kathy Hochul would win by around 5 percentage points in our prediction, and she won by just over 5 percentage points, more like 6 percentage points. And the reason why it was such a narrow, I guess, lead for Hochul in such a democratic state is because of 3 issues, or 3 factors. So first, crime. Crime, no doubt, has been increasing in New York City over the past 2 years. It's become a much bigger issue, but I would say that crime isn't as major as a lot of people make it out to be, at least when you look at the statistics. But yet, Republicans use this issue really smartly to appeal to New York suburban voters, and that's the second factor, because a lot of those suburban voters are commuters who go to New York City every single weekday, and so the issue of crime certainly appeals to those kinds of voters, and it doesn't help that there are individual events that help exemplify that effect. In New York subway systems, the MTA, or the New York subway systems, I mean, there's been crime increasing in those areas, highly visible, high profile crimes that have occurred, including a shooting that happened a few months ago in Brooklyn, and then you had a string of what you would most probably be able to say are hate crimes against Asian Americans by essentially shoving Asian Americans into the subway tracks. So those kinds of individual events, they are individualistic, and they don't represent the majority of cases of people going through the subway systems, but because those kinds of events are so gory, I would say, it's very easy to kind of instill fear among the New York public, or at least the New York suburban voters, not particularly the New York City people themselves, because they've seen everything. But New York suburban voters have been influenced by those kinds of events. And then you also have the economy. The economy is a nationwide issue, but yeah, it does apply here in New York, because New York City, even though it has somewhat recovered since the COVID-19 pandemic, it hasn't fully recovered at all. It's still, in a lot of metrics, it's still performing much worse than it was before the pandemic, with businesses having stay-at-home work policies, and then generally the tourism in New York City not being as high as it was previously. So those kinds of factors, and as well as like the move out of several of companies from New York City to places like Miami, those kinds of factors help the Republican talking points with saying like, oh, New York City COVID-19 lockdown policies really hurt the city. And then you can also say that high taxes in the city are causing businesses to move out. And then you can also another issue you could talk about is education. A lot of suburban voters care about education, particularly in Nassau County. And with COVID lockdowns, that did heavily affect on the kids' education levels. And that's why Zeldin was able to kind of flip this county from Democratic to Republican in this governor's race. So what does all of this have on the rest of the races? If we look at down ballot races, you'll see that Republicans were able to flip a lot of these districts where Lee Zeldin did well. George Santos won against Robert Zimmerman, which this seat was originally Tom Suozzi's seat, who is a Democrat. And then you also have Anthony Despacito, who won against Lauren Gillen in a Biden plus 10 district, I believe, which is pretty astounding, but it makes sense considering that a lot of these suburban voters have been fed up with a lot of the issues that have been going on around New York City. And then you have Sean Patrick Maloney losing his seat, Pat Ryan only winning his seat by tilt margins, and then Mark Molinaro winning his seat by lean margins, or flipping this seat by lean margins. And at this point, I mean, New York may very well be the reason why the Republican Party single-handedly wins the House of Representatives. Is because Democrats just didn't respond to these issues quickly enough. They only really started responding when polls showed Hochul underwater, or not underwater, but by close margins in late or mid to late October. But by then, it was already too late. I mean, if you want to change the messaging that has been instilled on the New York suburban residents over the past several months, it's very hard to change that kind of messaging. And yeah, that's what led to a lot of these races going to the Republican Party. And you can even affirm these kinds of theories when you look at the state assembly races, which is something that we commonly forget in these kinds of analyses. If you look at these are the Long Island suburb districts, and a lot of them have gone to the Republican Party by very large margins, 66, 58, 65 percentage points. These are places that normally would have voted Democratic in presidential races. And then you see here among the Democrats that have won, 16th district right here, if we go to the map, 16th district is over here, one of the Long Island suburbs. North of Mineola, it's in Kings Point, this area. This is a traditional suburb, and if you look at, if I can go here, if you look at this, Democrat only won by 4 points. That's pretty poor. And then if you look at the assembly districts where Asian Americans have a plurality or a majority of the district, you'll see that Republicans actually won in these races. 49th district, this is supposed to be a pretty democratic place where there are a ton of Asian Americans. In Brooklyn, it's around the area where the subway attack actually occurred, where the shooting in New York City subways back a couple of months ago. You can see here that Chang won against an incumbent Democrat by 4 points. 45th district, 46th districts, those should be 46th district. Also, they're also Brooklyn suburb. and then 45th district. I don't know why it did that, but yeah, 48th district, Asian Americans, 51st district. But yeah, I mean, you kind of get the point, which is that a lot of these voters have been concerned over time, and that's what's caused them to vote for the Republican Party. Yeah, also, I mean, Flushing. This is Flushing's district, and you can see here that Kim only won by 4 percentage points. But this actually has very much connections, a lot of the same connections as the 2020 election in California. You saw that Republicans did particularly well in the Orange County suburbs of Los Angeles, and then they were also able to keep this seat in Hollywood and then flip the seat in the Central Valley region. It was much of the same kinds of arguments that New York Democrats are making on crime as well as the economy being fiscally responsible. And that's why, I mean, that's why you see a lot of these blue states that these states have been historically Democratic becoming competitive in individual bases, becoming competitive in this cycle. So yeah, that's what's happening in New York and Florida. That's why those states have been particularly favorable for the Republican Party. We might talk about next up Colorado and how it's been a success for the Democratic Party, and then also the future of both parties when it comes to the 2024 election. But until then, that's the end of this video. Hope you enjoyed it. This video is now adjourned, and I'll see you in the next one.